Greetings, welcome to the Geoff Matthews podcast. Today I want to discuss whether renewable energy will drive economic growth and competitive advantage of nations, and also to discuss the topic of degrowth. Now, back in 2019, I gave a speech to the Future Aluminium Forum in Warsaw, Poland. The speech was entitled The Future of Electricity. And as part of that speech, or the fallout from that speech, the forum released a media release calling for a freedom of renewables. And the thrust of it was that even some developed countries were holding back the development of renewable energy. And the thrust of my speech was renewable energy was going to drive economic growth for the next 25 to 30 years and become a source of international competitiveness amongst nations. Now, before I gave the speech and the forum released the media release, we did run it past the IEA. That's the International Energy Agency, of course. Now, the IEA responded by saying that they didn't think there was any evidence to show the cost of electricity was tied to economic growth in developed nations. They said there was some evidence in the least developed countries to that the cost of electricity was linked to economic growth. Now, I should have pushed back in 2019. My mistake. I should have released my media release as it was. I took some words and paragraphs out, changed them, but if I'd thought about it a little bit harder, it was obvious that all of those developed nations were in fact using the commodity of fossil fuels to underpin the price of electricity in their countries. And therefore, because they all had access to cheap fossil fuels, a commodity on the world market, the price of electricity was much of a muchness, and it wasn't a big factor in their economic growth. I could see that argument now and why that held up. But I want to come now to 2023, because the IEA in the latest World Energy Outlook, the IEA published in January 2023, I'll read the sentence out, remembering what I said back in 2019, which they rejected. Clean energy becomes a huge opportunity for growth and jobs and a major area for international economic competition. So between 2019 and 2023, the IEA have shifted their view of that. I want to look at actually why they've shifted their view, and then we'll talk a little bit about degrowth. So the reason they've shifted their view is, if you look deeper into that IEA report, you'll find that they are predicting in 2025 for the world to, for the first time ever, to use less fossil fuels than it did the year before. Now, for the last 100 years, and while the IEA said that the cost of electricity wasn't tied to economic growth, the use of fossil fuels is absolutely tied to economic growth. And for the last 100 years, they've tracked like that. And fossil fuels and economic growth in the world is tracked like that. And as the more we use fossil fuels, the more we grow. Now, you could say, oh, well, the more we grow, the more we use fossil fuels. Whatever, they're tied together. The more we grow, the more we use fossil fuels. The more we use fossil fuels, the more we grow. And now imagine that the use of fossil fuels goes like this, and then suddenly in 2025 it takes a dip. So what does that mean for economic growth? Well, what's going to replace it? And the economic growth to keep going, if fossil fuels takes a dip, will of course be renewables. And renewable energy will take over from either the driver, or the more we use, the more we grow, the more we use. But renewable energy will take that dotted line up in terms of economic growth. So therefore, the IEA have to predict renewables will be a driver of economic growth, jobs, and competitive advantage of nations. Now, in terms of jobs, they've even put a figure on it. It's an extra 30 million jobs in renewable energy by 2030. So we're not talking a small amount of growth in renewable energy jobs. So, and that brings me this line: fossil fuel growth, economic growth. can we keep tracking on like this forever? And this is where the proponents of degrowth are starting to get some traction and to make some very logical arguments, I'd say. And I want to quote from an article from Dr. Catherine Knight, who's an award-winning writer and journalist in New Zealand. And in a recent article, she says this, and I'll read this out. But the year-on-year exponential growth of both national and global economies has only been enabled by the one-off windfall discovery and exploitation of fossil fuels, oil and natural gas. This has been the lifeblood of our economy for the last century. That's unarguable. That is fact. That we are using resources, a one-off. There's a finite amount of resources, and we're using them to drive economic growth. And she then goes and examines the pathway of degrowth, and which is, she says, is gaining broad traction. And what is degrowth? Look, the proponents of degrowth, they're not talking about our economy should go backwards. They're talking about there are areas of our economies that we need to let go backwards, or we need to even regulate so they go backwards faster. And some of it, and we also need to very much change the consumer behaviour and patterns of consumer behaviour so these areas go back. One of the big ones, of course, fossil fuels has got to go backwards. One of the big ones is the fashion industry. It's fast fashion. One of the biggest polluters on the planet now. And I noticed this, I've read articles from two influencers recently, two fashion influencers, both out of the UK. One of them saying that they weren't going to buy any new clothes for 2023. And the other said they were only going to buy 5 new items in 2023. And those sorts of changes in consumer behaviour are going to change the way we look at things. Also, how recyclable are our clothes? The thought is we actually don't want to recycle them. We would rather they compost. And that comes, into, plastic buttons and bits and things of these clothes. And are they better composting? And are we better just not buying new? So there are areas of the economy. The other one is aviation. France has banned short-haul flights where there are trains en route. I think COVID has affected long-haul aviation, but it's I think the cost of it will naturally stay high after COVID, and therefore the cheap tourism that was going on around the world may be a thing of the past. And there's also there's probably a few other industries that require us to go backwards. And so, but then the proponents of degrowth say that, well, there's areas of the economy that need to go forward. We need to develop renewable energy faster. We need to look after our people better in terms of sustainable food production, sustainable healthcare, access to education, access to public transport, public amenities. So they're saying degrowth is not a backwards of the economy. It's a reshaping of the economy and economic growth as we've known it for the last 100 years. And what's my prediction on this? My futurist prediction? Well, obviously, I think economic growth will renewable energy and access to renewable energy will drive economic growth. Now, and you might say, well, Geoff, that's pretty obvious. It's not really a futurist prediction now. One of the issues that is there that needs addressing is this access. So I'm a believer that industry and even people, but especially industry, should be allowed to build their own renewable energy, clean renewable energy resources and use their own power. Now, in a lot of countries, that's restricted. A lot of countries, you can't do that. You can't build your own power plant and use your own power. You actually have to get a license to build a power plant, put it into the national grid, and then buy it back off the state-owned national grid. And the reason that the state's doing that is it's a monopoly on electricity, and it provides funds in the coffers of government. I believe I believe if governments choke the electricity sector and don't allow the freedom of renewables, then they're going to choke their own economies. And simply business will move to where they can establish their own renewable energies and operate at low cost. That's going to be the competitive advantage of nations. And, you might have thought, people attracting businesses with taxation systems, well, it might be the access to be able to develop your own freedom of renewables. And so that's an area that I think that we should watch with interest. And hopefully it will become freer and freer. By the way, going all the way back to that press release in 2019, what I was calling for was a freedom of renewables index, where all the countries, the developed countries, were ranked in how free people were and industry was to be able to establish their own renewable energy generation and use it. And I think you'll find that some of the more developed countries would rank pretty poorly in that if you line them up now. And I still think that index would be valuable, and I still think that in the future, industry is going to look for sources of cheap and clean renewable energy. And if we want to retain our industries and to continue on an economic growth mode, then we need to be able to develop our renewable energy faster, cleaner, and with the least amount of restrictions.